Spectrovision Radio.
I remember reading an account of something that happened 2 days before the end of the zombie plague. The head of a DAS team got a report of a gathering of zombies inside a tunnel under the Rosslyn metro station just west of DC. So they went down there and they started poking around the tunnel, and they got a call from the station chief that a train was coming in, even though they'd all been shut down that morning. So here comes a train with all its lights off, coming along real slow as the DAS squad waited on the platform. The train stopped, and the doors opened, and zombies came out of 3 of the cars, stepping right out onto the platform. How they all got in there? No explanation, no clues. The DAS put them down quick, and then the head of the team, a man named Vanderwall, entered the front car, but no one was in the driver's compartment. He'd run for it already. With a 2 or 3 minute head start, he got away. Vanderwall was in the dark, deep in the tunnel, and he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a zombie walking his way. A middle-aged woman in a shawl and a baggy sweater. She was making a strange sound. When Vanderwall got to within 20 feet or so, he determined that she was singing. There were no actual words coming out of her mouth, of course. It was like a person singing in their sleep, half mumbled, coming from deep inside the zombie's throat. Before she fell over and stayed totally motionless, anyone could tell that there was music coming from that mouth. No one had ever heard anything like that. For all Vanderwall knew, that singing woman may have been the very first of them to lie down and just not get up again.
Part 1. Buckystown.
My name is Lionel Gathers. I'm 32, and I guess I'm just a waiter. On May 2nd, the principals of the story and I came down through Frederick in my second-hand van. Frederick, Maryland, that is. And at some point around 2 o'clock, we passed a minor league baseball stadium. On some instinct, I decided to cruise around it. And I saw that the center field wall had been partially removed, and the outer chain-link fence that surrounded the stadium was wide open. So I drove the van through the gap in the wall and right into the outfield. Bump, 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 and we parked it and got out. The 5 of us were standing in the middle of this big empty stadium. I tried to get a sense of the atmosphere and the silence. I asked Athena to reach into the back of the van and very carefully bring out my weapons. Only when I had my weapons in hand did I relax. Now, when I say weapons, yes, it was the softball equipment my dear fiancée had bought me for Christmas. She would later claim that my whole plan, as soon as I saw the stadium, was to shamelessly sucker everyone into playing, and that my talk of a picnic was a pathetic smokescreen. And she'd be kind of right, but how many chances do you get? A quick rundown of the athletic skills of the group. Mouse's was 71 and a college professor, so he couldn't handle anything more strenuous than cribbage. My fiancée, Athena, was an artist and so refused to play outright. Ronnie was ex-military, actually still military but AWOL for 6 months then. So he had power and bat speed but could not handle my famous demon pitch. And Melissa was, well, a 17-year-old girl into video games. The fact that she hit my famous demon pitch back directly at my head should only be taken as an outlier situation and not a reflection of my athletic dominance, which is total. We did get our picnic right there in the middle of the diamond. Just some roast beef sandwiches and a lot of chocolate pudding, and a 6-pack of Pepsi. And we all gave Melissa her birthday presents, such as they were. That sunshine, that perfect weather, made me just never want to leave that day. It wouldn't have been ruined, I suppose, if Ronnie and I hadn't finished eating so early and run back to hit more balls at each other. The second pitch Ronnie looked out on, he hit it to the right field corner, and it bounced through another gap in the outfield fence into some area where it looked like they had stored away the groundskeeping equipment. I absolutely did not want to lose that ball, so I made him walk after it. The area behind the right field fence was underneath an overhang of bleacher seats. The bullpen was off to one side, and tucked to the right was a big, shadowy area full of rakes and bags of grass seed and hoses and paint, that kind of thing. The ball had rolled into a little patch of what I figured was mulch. I picked it up, and it was covered in the stuff. And I wiped it off on the ground, but the stuff was blacker than mulch and much finer. So I saw that I was wrong. I filtered some of it through my fingers and realized what it really was. There was a corner that bent even further to the right, deeper behind the right field stands. That was where I saw what I absolutely did not want Melissa to see. Ronnie came up behind me, and he saw it too. When we went back to the picnic, I guess our poker faces were not so good. Ronnie and I babbled something about how no one should go back behind the outfield wall because there was a lot of rusty construction equipment back there in a pit, just waiting for someone to fall in and break a spleen. And Melissa took 2 more bites of her pudding and got right up and started walking into the outfield. She had some weird sense of where we'd been and what we were trying to hide. She turned to the right, and we all caught up to her, and I at least found the lights inside that partially open shed and hit them so we could all see what had happened. The walls of that room had been scarred by a flame, and the equipment in it had been burned beyond recognition. I recognized a lawnmower and several sections of a short wooden fence. But most of the space was empty cement floor, which was also blackened. You could make out human forms in the heaps of ash, arms outstretched, torso still intact, hands, feet, entire zombies which had seemingly been in motion when they were burned. Most of them had been burned away to almost nothing. Turning around, I saw that there was a sliding wall behind us which could have been shut tight as they were immolated. Mouses remembered later that they'd been burned so thoroughly that there wasn't even that smell of rot and decay. Somewhere along the line, I suppose I had promised Melissa that we wouldn't try to protect her from that sort of thing, as long as she was with us. But that kind of promise couldn't really mean anything. It just couldn't. I mean, seeing something like what she saw in that shed, how do I explain that to someone who just turned 17 that day? And of course, she brushed it off like it was nothing and called me a big honking bozo for trying to hide it. We packed everything up, what little there was to pack, and we rolled the van out of there just before dusk. And this is why I was so grateful to have Melissa with us sometimes. No one was saying much of anything a few minutes after we left the stadium, but when a Whitney Houston song came on the radio, Melissa put her hands to her ears and wailed long and loud, and claimed she would physically die and come back to life again and eat only the brains of the people inside this van if I didn't put a CD in that very second. Everyone laughed, and we were past it. And that was Thursday. The thing that bothered Athena was that neither Ronnie nor I really showed a lot of repulsion on seeing that pile. I kind of blame cognitive retreat for that, really. That's the fancy term Mouse has used for the persistent feeling of utter disconnect from the horror of the zombie situation. The so-called awakening of the dead held so many properties of the absurd, along with so many properties of the tragic and the nightmarish, that society and the individual's reaction to it was simply one of functional, deeply embedded shock. It was so reminiscent of bad horror movies that we as a whole came to believe that the best way to get along was to act as if we really were in a bad horror movie, And so true grief and outrage were often sublimated in favor of crazed fear and hilarity. We were all walking around in a dream. It would certainly have been different had the zombies been aggressive or attacked at will, or were bent on revenge. But there was none of that. They were as harmless as stones. And this, Mouses would say, was the true catalyst which brought about nationwide insanity. And when the zombies simply began to collapse wherever they stood and rest in peace again, just a few months after they had risen, the dream state began to fade. Like no other tragedy or uproar in American history, what happened that year started a weird, silent, and shared desire amongst people all over the land to simply stop everything that could be stopped, for as long as was humanly possible. The machinery of society should have gotten back up and running again in March, but it did not. After weeks of hand-wringing and confusion, schools should have reopened, small business people should have gotten back behind their counters, bad movies should have been made, but they weren't. Workers who had left their jobs to collect themselves didn't return, leaving thousands of companies scuffling to stay afloat. It was like 200-odd years of the American way of pacing ourselves had crashed to a halt, and everyone just needed a breather, just one, before setting the wheels spinning again. Colleges wiped out entire semesters because students decided to take them off. Thousands of businesses had to close because no one came back to drive cabs or make French fries. It took something truly freakish to do that. A massive tragedy or the start of a war couldn't have done it. These things make Americans want to get back to work quickly, to take their minds off things. Maybe with the dead up and walking, there was just too much to think about. And everyone wanted to take their time sorting out the universe somewhat before getting back to the endless grind. Or maybe it wasn't as complicated as even that. Maybe everyone needed a vacation. They saw the chance for it, and they did not care. Hey, if the logical universe isn't going to live up to its responsibilities, why should we? Our plan after we left the stadium that day was to drift in a southerly way and find a place to spend the night, probably a campground. Ronnie seemed to be getting more and more concerned with being spotted somehow and arrested. And even walking around a place like that made him uneasy, so it was getting tougher for us all to agree on just where we were going. Athena didn't feel comfortable with taking Melissa more than a few hundred miles away from Altoona, so it was all very day-to-day. We kept putting gas in the van, and we kept moving. But our progress, however you define it, was slowing. We saw 3 or 4 zombies lying in an enormous field off to our right, somewhere south of a place called Lime Kiln. The cleanups were still very slow. Mouses was the one who pointed out the elementary school coming up on our left. We'd happened upon some sort of very small town, and it was going to be dark soon. So I wanted to check it out, even though Athena had her usual resistance to the idea of breaking and entering. The place was basically your average-sized school for grades 1 through 5, just 1 story high. Nice big playground out back, nothing special. But it looked a lot like the school I went to when I was a kid, except this one had much spiffier monkey bars, a definite plus. We swung the van beside the cafeteria, where it would be safely out of sight, and took a quick walk around the side facing the woods. Most of the windows were unlocked, and we had our pick of which classrooms to enter. Mouses and Athena got the sleeping bags and the lanterns out of the van, and went back in through a door Ronnie had propped open for us. So far as we could tell, no one would ever suspect we were in there. Not only was the water working, but there was a locker room beside the gym/cafeteria/auditorium, and showers too, which was phenomenal. So Ronnie and I could shoot baskets for an hour or so in the gym, and then we could bathe. Melissa got up on the stage with a mat she'd taken from a pile in the corner, and she did her Pilates and listened to the CDs I'd given her for her birthday. And eventually it got dark. She was always a little different after dark, seemed to me. She was visibly uneasy navigating the few hallways with the lantern, and she decided to wait for morning to have her shower. She camped out in a classroom with Athena with the door closed and did not move for the rest of the night. I think I beat Ronnie like 117-3 in basketball. I'm pretty sure that was the score. He and Mouses and I hung out in a different classroom after dark, and we had our first real discussion about things in about a week. Athena would have knocked me silly if she'd found out we were having man talk without her, but Melissa needed her company, and Ronnie had some things on his mind. Mouses had gotten real fascinated in a Lippincott fourth grade reader, and we had to snap him out of it to join the discussion. Ronnie's parents had died 9 weeks into the whole zombie thing. They'd gone off the deep end, paranoia-wise, and gone to a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and at some point during their hiding, something had gone wrong with the heating system, and they'd apparently died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Their possessions had been found in the cabin, and their car, and physical evidence of a huge carbon monoxide leak, but they were gone. So you can sort of deduce what had become of them. So in the very beginning, our idea had been to slowly work our way down to Georgia, where his parents would have been. Being AWOL, he couldn't use his name, so he had no idea how he would go about finding out where his parents were. He just wanted to make sure they'd been found and buried properly. Maybe if he just drove around the area, he thought he might find them. He couldn't really decide if it was something he truly wanted to do, so he didn't object to our slow going, not at all. It gave him time to think, to prepare himself maybe. Meanwhile, we'd been zigzagging across Pennsylvania like vagrants. The thing was, did we take Melissa all the way down to, say, Georgia? Did we go all the way with this adventure like I wanted to? Bringing Melissa along meant being somewhat responsible, which of course ruins every great plan. We'd met her on Porch Lane just before this all started. After a huge thunderstorm had wiped out everyone's power in the neighborhood, her folks, having been called away for the weekend to a funeral, she'd knocked on our door to tell us a line had dropped in our backyard. We chatted her up, and she asked Athena a million questions about how she taught art and what she charged for it. Then she'd gone off towards town to find a place to charge her music player. But instead of heading for the road, she went off toward the woods, where a skinny trail had been naturally beaten down over the years, leading about a quarter of a mile toward Monroe Street. And Athena and I had both called out to her, said it was growing dark, and that didn't seem at all safe. There were still a few storm clouds rolling through, and it was the woods. And Melissa turned back to us, and the look on her face told us she'd already had plenty enough of petty adult fears. Thank you very much. We'd only learn later how carefully her parents had tried to guard her world and the inevitable backlash that had sown. There was a confidence in Melissa in that one moment that was a little scary in its defiance. Flash forward to now, and we couldn't decide what to do, to keep puttering around the Northeast like kids with her in tow, or maybe roam the South, pumping folk music out the window like total potheads. Mouses was a pothead in the 60s, he told me so. Like I couldn't have figured that out by myself. Anyone that rational and academic had to be covering for some serious toking in bygone years. Mouses found me in the art room around midnight. We sat for a while and looked out the window, which overlooked the playground. I asked the old coot the one thing I always did whenever we were away from everyone else, which was how long he thought we had out here on the run from everything that mattered. More specifically, how long it would be before the world was finally able to move on. He said, "Come with me," and I followed him outside to the blacktop in the courtyard, the playground. And we stood there, and he pointed at some kind of industrial equipment. He said, "See, they're relining the blacktop and filling in the sand around the monkey bars." It was impossible to tell when the stuff had been brought in, but maybe, he said, they were preparing the grounds for the September school year, or even summer school. That made more sense. That's why they were doing it now, not in August. The kids were going to come back soon, he thought. We stood there in the dark, thinking about it. So we had to leave in a day or so. But where would we go? For Mouse's, the goal was to stave off the miasma of his recent retirement. Soon it would be just him and his books and his beard for years and years. For Ronnie, it was escape from the army and to resolve his parents' last details. But at what point would this mean having to sleep legally in motels and shop in packed supermarkets and, God forbid, go back to work? Back inside, we had the radio going on in one corner, and literally, right in the middle of our conversation, someone came on WAMU with a story about how the military's AWOL amnesty was not only being shortened out of nowhere, but the penalties for getting caught beyond that had been stiffened like the wrath of God. 3 years in jail for desertion. Suddenly, Ronnie didn't have till the end of July to turn himself in. He had until next Wednesday. Dear Marianne, something very interesting happened to me the other night. I've been knocking around the state with a little group of people that Athena and I managed to collect somehow. Her old mentor at the university from when she was 22, and an ex-military guy named Ronnie who got into a little bit of trouble and took off from that whole mess, and our next-door neighbor's kid from Altoona, Melissa. She's 17 and lobbied hard to come with us, much to the ire of her parents, but they didn't have much say in the matter. Anyway, we've been moving from place to place, and one night we pitched camp inside Gerard Manley Hopkins Elementary School in Buckystown, Maryland. So in the middle of the night, I was up and poking around with a lantern around the principal's office and such. Just bored. Couldn't sleep. At one point, I had to go to the bathroom, and while I was standing there at the fountain, I got the shock of my life when I saw that someone was watching me. It was a zombie, standing just outside the window at 2 a.m. She was about 60, I would say, maybe even a little older. She was wearing a blue house dress. I hadn't seen more than 4 or 5 of them on their feet since they all started to lie down again. I actually moved a little bit closer to her, and the strangest part of it was, I thought I had seen this zombie somewhere before. Now, theoretically, that's impossible because we've been moving just a little too fast for a single zombie to keep up with us, but the feeling of deja vu was pretty powerful. After gawking at me for about 15 seconds, the zombie turned and walked off toward the playground. But just before I started writing this to you, I had a sudden flash of where I'd seen that zombie before. On our first morning at the elementary school, we all got in the van after a granola breakfast and went out exploring a little. We decided to hang on to our haven. After only 2.5 weeks on the road, we'd gotten somehow really tired. Athena had never seen a farm stand she could pass up and shouted, "Produce emergency!" getting Melissa to join her in an irritating chant. So that was the first place we stopped. It was right at the bottom of a huge sloping field, and there was a nice little farmhouse at the top of it, about 200 yards away. And in the driveway, I saw a specimen control van. Now, the driveway led all the way down the slope, getting thinner and thinner until it hit the road, just about 50 feet or so from where the little vegetable stand was. So I figured the girl taking our money and handing us the bags of strawberries must have known about the van and why it was there. So here we were, 5 customers at a fruit stand, and 4 of us staring up at the specimen control van, only Melissa still engrossed in the cantaloupes. And of course, the girl running the stand had to notice. So she told us what the van was about. Her name was Donna. Her grandfather's doctor had called the specimen control people a couple of days before, because that was the law. And they called back to make sure the family was going to be there. And then they came, kind of late at night, and they showed the family what to do when their grandpa died. It was almost like a weird little class they gave them in their living room. They took a look at the bed he lay in and then gave the family the correct restraints for it and showed them how to tie them. They showed them how to gum his eyes down so he wouldn't be able to see anything if he came awake again. They had them take everything out of the room that they could except for a couple of chairs. They said that when he died, they should just take a few minutes alone with him, no more than 5 or 10 at the most, and make sure the window was sealed tight, and wedge a block the guys gave them underneath the door, and adjust it with a little tool so that the door couldn't be opened from inside. And then Donna was supposed to call them right away, and they would come and take him away. So they signed something, and the specimen control guys told them they'd do what they were supposed to do, and the hospice woman went back upstairs to sit with Grandpa. But the kind of funny part was the two guys who gave the family the talk couldn't get their van started when they went out to leave. They tried, and Donna's brother tried to give him a jump start, but nothing worked. So he tinkered around in there, and he figured out that their alternator was fried, and the van wasn't going anywhere. It was almost 11 o'clock by then. So Donna's brother said that if they wanted, he could run over to his friend Larry's parts place and get them a used replacement alternator and put it in for him, rather than them having to wait for a tow and maybe not have the van fixed till God knows when by some garage. The specimen control guys, Don and Cal, said that would be great, but they didn't want to impose. But Donna's brother got in their Mercury and went off to Larry's, and the guys, Don and Cal, wound up staying with them and watching the end of a rerun of Saturday Night Live on Comedy Central down in the living room while Donna and the hospice woman stayed with Grandpa. And then their mother said everyone looked hungry, so she made everyone breakfast at 1 a.m, plenty of eggs and waffles and bacon, and even though Donna's brother had just about fixed the van by then, Don and Cal were more than happy to stay and eat breakfast with Donna and her brother and her uncle. Those specimen control guys wound up calling into their dispatcher and staying the night. Donna figured the guys would get in the van and leave as soon as the family woke up, but they didn't. Mom cooked for them again and had the food ready as soon as they got up. And Grandpa wasn't looking so good, so Don and Cal called in again and said they were just going to wait there until they got another call they might absolutely have to take. Donna's grandpa died on Friday night. Don and Cal told Donna it would be best if the family got into the car and went for a little drive together, just for a half hour or so, while they took care of things. When they returned, Don and Cal had taken Grandpa away and set everything back in the bedroom just the way they'd had it to begin with. And they've left a note thanking the family for being so nice to them, with their phone numbers in case they ever needed them for any other reason, even if it was just to help move Grandpa's things to the shed, like the family had meant to do. And they wrote that if they or anyone they knew needed their car looked at, they would be happy to send Donna's brother the business instead of calling a garage. After we met her at that farm stand, we were just tooling around looking for a place to do some laundry, and Athena was poking through the town newspaper, which was the first thing she did whenever we went to a new place. And she spotted something in the events calendar, all 3 lines of it, and said we had to take a spin by the Buckystown Cultural Center, because there was an art exhibit she wanted to check out. These were some of Melissa's favorite parts about the trip, when Athena would force us to go see these little out-of-the-way art galleries. Athena would give her a quick education about this and that. Now, if I had tried to tell Melissa who Modigliani was, she would have put her headphones on and stuck an L on her forehead. I should never have admitted to her that I'd been waiting tables at Ruby Tuesday. She lost all respect for me when she saw me in my uniform. The Buckystown Cultural Center was just the kind of place Athena wanted to run someday. It was in a little sliver of a row house between a flower shop and, luckily for us, a laundromat. So I would have the perfect excuse to hop out early if it turned out we were due for a half hour of pottery or Egyptian beads. And wouldn't you know it, the subject of this week's exhibit was The Walking Dead in Art and Memory. Talk about too soon. That didn't dissuade my fiancée. Athena just wants to lap up everything cultural. She's a fiend. She was in year 3 of trying with opera, bless her weird heart. To me, culture is when there's a Simpsons marathon on and I have a box of Ritz crackers handy. So I am willing to field questions about how she wound up stuck on me. The exhibit right in front was really strange. It was called 7 Days with Lev. Some photographer had just randomly decided to call a zombie Lev and followed him around for a week, snapping photographs of him as he went. The last photo was of Lev getting cremated. I figured the photographer had reported him, but According to the cards below each photo, it had just happened naturally. On the 7th day of following Lev, he had been rounded up with 2 other zombies and burned. The best photo, in Ronnie's opinion, was this gorgeous shot of a creek somewhere up in the Adirondacks. A real Ansel Adams type of thing. Snow everywhere. Snow was actually falling as the picture was snapped. And way in the back of the frame, there was a deer licking at the surface of the creek, and directly across the bank from it was a zombie, just watching it. Except the zombie had one arm lifted toward the deer, like he was going to ask him a question. There was one very, very good photo of a zombie's face, very close up, camera maybe 8 inches away. So well done, I was very surprised I'd never seen it in a magazine or newspaper before. It reminded me of that famous National Geographic cover of the young, hooded Middle Eastern girl, the one with the big blue eyes. The zombie in this photo was quite old, and its hair was flying about its head crazily, but there was a strange glimmer of something in its eyes. Or maybe it was just the way the eyes were directed past the camera person at some unseen horizon, as if the zombie were contemplating a long journey. Melissa couldn't take her eyes off that one. We'd been there for 15 minutes when Athena came up to me, ashen-faced, and just tugged on my sleeve and guided me into one of the smaller side rooms, and she pointed, and I saw that one of the paintings was her own. It was called If You Remember Me at All, and it hung beside a window. She'd done If You Remember Me at All 2 years before. It had been sold at a group show in Philadelphia to a man who owned 30% of a pro basketball team, but who'd had a pretty good eye. And the painting had been packed up for him, and Athena had taken his check, and she'd never seen it again. So you can figure out for yourself, of course, that since the painting was 2 years old, it had absolutely nothing to do with the living dead. The man shown in the painting climbing a brick fence that divided a cemetery from the grounds of a sheet metal foundry was not a zombie, but because his features were so obscured, what could anyone else have thought, standing there in an art gallery surrounded by the undead, having no clue that Athena had been painting an image she'd remembered from when she was a child and visiting her father at the foundry. The man in the painting had been a co-worker of his, who sometimes hopped over the boundary fence to have his lunch there, because he'd found the cafeteria in the foundry to be far more sad than eating his sandwiches in the old cemetery. Athena's piece had a price tag on it, and it was selling for about 1/3 of what she'd originally gotten for it, with all the proceeds going to the arts center. So apparently the guy who originally bought it had donated it outright to them, and maybe they'd just never been able to contact Athena about it. Maybe for him the associations it had were just too eerie once the zombies started to walk. It had become too strange to have that piece hanging on his wall. Athena didn't put up any kind of fuss about it that day. I suppose there wouldn't have been much point. But she was a little bit different through the rest of the day. The painting thing had really gotten to her. It just kind of drove it all home how much had slipped away because of the damned zombies. I saw Melissa talking to some 40-ish guy off to the side, and at first I thought he was just asking her directions or something, but then he pulled out a business card and handed it to her. So I drifted over to see what was up. I was supposed to be some kind of temporary father figure here, even though Melissa would probably have laughed in my face if she heard me say that. He had just come out and introduced himself to her as Douglas Widgeon, a freelance TV producer, and he said he was beginning work on a documentary about how the whole zombie thing had affected people in their teens, and even younger than that. And he was looking for subjects to interview on camera. For money, too. He said he was paying for the interviews, so Melissa had no problem with that. The concept of the documentary would be, yes, the effects of the crisis on Americans to whom this was the first real catastrophe they were fully cognizant of, and to a lesser extent how it affected their view of God and their own mortality, which they hadn't even had a chance to fully grasp yet. This was something Widgeon hadn't bothered to shop around first. He just wanted to do it on spec, grab a cameraman from nearby WHTK, and make it his weekend project for a while. Turn it around in 3 months. Athena told Melissa she couldn't think of any real objections to her being in the documentary. And Widgeon was offering a couple of $100 for a few hours of her time, plus he said if we liked, we could go out to his car and he could show us the questions he'd prepared for it. He could call his friend the cameraman and he could tape her that afternoon, and we could be on our way. And since we were right next door to this cute little outdoor cafe, we all decided to have lunch over it. Over BLTs, Widgeon told us about his rather mentally exhausting work in TV. And that eventually led him speaking of a reality show that one network had supposedly talked about, one which I didn't really think was possible. Athena believed it right away. She despises TV. Widgeon said he'd been talking to a friend of his who worked at CBS, and the guy related an idea for a reality show that he'd heard kicked around for a couple of weeks, back when the zombies were still seriously walking. It was the baby of the guy who had produced Time Machine 2005, which, as stupid as it was, had actually been a clever idea once. Apparently he'd been talking with someone about going out and somehow getting 100 zombies or so and cooping them up somewhere in the east for a few months, and then transporting them off to an island off Florida. And the show would consist of just one man or maybe a married couple who had to live on that island with the zombies for a full year, constantly in fear of getting scratched, you would figure, as they just got plain weirded out every single day. Widgeon said that maybe one of the concepts would have been that they would take a very pacifist person and plop them down there on the island and watch how over the course of a year, irritated by zombies 24 hours a day, they might resort to a bit of the old ultraviolence. As Athena put it, you could go on the internet anytime you wanted and buy a bumper sticker that said, "My other car is a specimen control van," or "Thanks, Elvis, for staying in your grave." So why would anyone think this reality show couldn't possibly happen? "Let's get real here for just a moment," she said. "We'll all be the better for it." And so, sis, we left the bright lights of Buckystown and found a very nice creek to hang out beside for a couple of hours, since the weather was freakishly perfect once again. We made a mental note to camp there whenever we left the elementary school. And at one point in my wandering around, I found a hiking trail and wandered along it for a bit. And there, on the trail, I swear on our mother's macaroni and cheese, was the zombie I'd seen the night before, the one who'd spied on me as I relieved myself. She was about 50 yards away and walking right towards me. When she got to within about 30 feet or so, she stopped and took a left and wandered deeper into the woods. Then I had an idea, which I was sure wouldn't work, but I figured I had nothing to lose. I ran back to the creek and rummaged around in Athena's things till I found her camera. Then I dashed back toward the trail again, and I went off in search of my stalker zombie. She had moseyed off the path and was walking through a very pretty little meadow. For the first time ever, I actually went towards a zombie, jogging in a very, very wide circle around the woman, and finally positioning myself in front of her, 50 yards away, kind of hiding behind a tree. At that moment, I had my worst ever case of the chills. All it took to bring them on was the sound of the woman's footsteps through the grass and the leaves. The footsteps stopped entirely for a moment, like she was figuring out where I had gone to. Then they started again. They got quieter as she hit a patch of what might have been smooth dirt. Then there was a crunch as a stick was stepped on and broken. The sounds of those footsteps just could not be real, and I couldn't be hiding behind a tree listening to them get closer. But there I was. For a moment, I was really terrified for the entire human race, because obviously all bets were off. When the zombie went past me, I stepped out from behind the tree and made a sound that was kind of like, "Ha!" And when her head turned, I snapped a photo of her face. She just stood there looking at me. So I ran off and got the hell out of there. I'm going to have that photograph developed real soon as part of a kind of plan I have cooking to satisfy my curiosity about where I've seen that zombie before. I'd been sitting on my sofa when the news from Vancouver came on the local news, back in January when it all started. I had the same reaction as everyone else, more or less, but not even a week had gone by before I got sort of pensive. And Athena could already tell what I was thinking about. I hadn't even considered going back to work as soon as the first reports came out. I suspected this was going to change everything. And yes, okay, I was yearning for it. I'd take the van out a lot and just drive around, and I'd feel guilty about how excited I sounded sometimes when I told Athena I'd seen military convoys and more businesses temporarily shut down for no other reason, seemingly, than it was acceptable to do it. I was about to be free. I can't really describe what that felt like. I remember running across the street to Mouse's house and banging on the screen door. I tried to frame my whole idea as a sociology trip, figuring that would con him into joining us, but the fact was he just didn't have a whole lot else going on. Those first few days of driving were the best, because the uncertainty of what was going on, with almost but not quite all the undead already packing it in and laying down, made it all seem like we'd wandered into some strange costume party where there were no rules. I loved it, I admit it. You know why? Because when I was at the wheel of the van, I wasn't a waiter or a bookstore clerk or an office temp anymore. I was a guy touring around with my fiancée and a professor of military history, and later a couple of more friends we met. I was a guy with an idea. Anyway, on the day we met Douglas Widgeon, our new, slightly expanded gang all got to bed, meaning our sleeping bags, pretty late that night. Widgeon came to the school about 9 with his cameraman, and we'd forgotten to tell him that there was no power in the school, so yeah, they had a little problem with the lighting. Melissa wound up being interviewed by the light of the lanterns we had, which Widgeon said would be fine, perfectly evocative. He talked to her for about an hour and a half, and Widgeon stayed after that, just to join in on the drinking, which took place in the empty office of someone named Principal Polly. We sat around and had some beer, me and Mouses and Ronnie and Widgeon. And Widgeon told us some good cynical stories about the TV biz, and we found out that he'd turned down a scholarship to Harvard when he was 19 out of some crazy kind of dream of being a world adventurer, and had slowly lost interest in both adventuring and going to college, both. He drank a little too much and decided to sleep in one of the classrooms, since the next day he wanted to hang around a bit and grab some second unit context footage of Melissa. And I was just about to leave and find Athena and crash out when the news came on. And they talked about how some soldiers posted in Manhattan had claimed they were attacked by 3 zombies, and one of the zombies had taken a bite out of a soldier's arm. There was a very disturbing sound clip from him about how the zombie's eyes never moved when it was biting him, just grabbed a hold of his elbow and sunk its teeth in. When the story was over, I looked at Ronnie, and Ronnie looked at me, and he said, "It's a goddamn lie, Lionel," with more bitterness than I had seen in him before. The first time Ronnie's unit had been sent out to take zombies down, it was a nasty, rainy Sunday night, cold, ugly, just the worst possible January situation you could ever want to have. And they'd been called off the New Jersey Turnpike to go into Atlantic City. Just 8 guys and 2 trucks. They'd known they were going to have to shoot some zombies down really soon, but not in that kind of ungodly weather and not that late at night. But Ronnie's CO told him over the radio that they were needed on the beach. The problem was no one had informed him where on the beach they should go. The entire city was pretty much on the beach. So they just headed in from the expressway, went down Pacific Avenue and slowed the trucks next to the Sands Hotel and got out, still dealing with this communication breakdown. It was about 90 seconds before the soldiers had something. There were about 7 zombies walking along the shore. That was an image that just blew Ronnie's mind. They were standing in the rain, freezing, 8 soldiers armed, with the ocean off to the right, the surf coming in really hard, their breath billowing out, and to the harmless zombies in the tide line backlit in this strange cloud of light. The rain and the mist from the ocean was hanging in the air, and the lights of the boardwalk and all the hotels and casinos shone through it and made it completely spectral to him. Ronnie told me they took them all down. And then they looked up, and there were more shadows on the beach. But these were regular people 100 yards away who'd left their hotels and come out to watch. Not one of them had an umbrella. They were afraid they were going to miss something, so they just went outside without them. 4 or 5 people just watching with newspapers covering their heads. Ronnie had dreamed of being a soldier from the time he was 5 years old and found a plastic bag filled with plastic army men in a parking lot. He still had every single one of those 40 little men and the original bag. Nothing had ever put him off his dream. That night, a few months before, was the first time he'd felt it slipping away. I'll end this chapter of the story by telling you what you see in Scene 7 of Song of the Living Dead, which is the name of Douglas Widgeon's documentary, shown on Minnesota Public Television in December of 2006. You hear the narrator talk about how Melissa was going through the zombie crisis without her parents, but by choice. She'd always had problems with her mother's and father's rules, and the zombie crisis quickly intensified the strain to the breaking point. When Melissa's parents decided to leave the country during the second week of the dead's return and completely seclude themselves until it was over, Melissa refused to go with them. Instead, she told them she would stay with some adult friends of hers who planned to wait out the crisis on the road, moving from town to town, observing what was happening to the country. She's very much a typical 17-year-old, the narrator says on the soundtrack. There's something different about Melissa, though, and there has been ever since the first week of the crisis. And then Melissa comes on the screen, and she tells the story of how one night, in the beginning, at about 2 a.m, she'd gotten up to get something to drink from the kitchen and didn't bother turning the lights on or anything. And she was just standing there, stirring sugar into this pitcher of iced tea. And there was this shadow right at the doorway, out of nowhere. It hadn't made any sound at all. There was a little tiny sound then when it shuffled its foot forward onto the floor. And that was it. It was just so much taller than her father, she knew instantly what it was. And she was right next to the drawer where all the cooking stuff was, and she opened it, and she felt around for a second and grabbed a big carving knife. And she went towards the shadow, and she started, as she puts it in the documentary, wailing away at it. She didn't think about it. She just took a few steps and started stabbing it. She guessed she was mad that it could just wander in like that. Her parents rushed in, panicked. They went insane, and her father grabbed her and led her out of there, outside, and her mother ran out too, screaming hysterically. Melissa found this a little pathetic. They're freaking out while having forgotten the obvious things like locking the front door at night. In the scene of the documentary where Melissa tells this story, Douglas Widgeon asks her on screen what it felt like to stab that person with a knife. And she says she doesn't remember that part of it. It got blocked out somehow. She doesn't even really remember her parents coming down the stairs. She remembered grabbing the knife out of the drawer and walking towards the shadow, but kind of cut out there. And her memory picked up again with her outside on the lawn, and a policeman talking to her, and a specimen control guy. Melissa, 17 years old, then goes on to explain her theory of life as the screen is filled with shots of some pictures she'd put up in her room at the elementary school that night, just in case we stayed a while. Pictures from magazines of bands she liked and animals. People get so bogged down in their problems, she explains, but they bring so much of it on themselves. I mean, my parents are that way too. It seems to me like when you're going about your business, every problem or every little thing that can cause you stress is sort of like a a big heavy suitcase just lying on the ground. If you don't want to pick it up, you don't have to. You just keep right on walking past if you want. You don't have to let the suitcases bog you down. My parents pick up every suitcase that gets in their way. It's like a lot of people, they're just weighed down. They complain about so much. They get obsessed over everything from the past and stuff that people try to throw in their face, or big things like zombies running around. But no one is forcing them to obsess over these things. They don't have to pick that stuff up off the ground. You make a choice, right? Melissa says. Just walk right past. Why suffer if you can just keep on going?
Part 2. Lake Linganore.
I woke up real early on Saturday because my plan was to somehow get breakfast bought and prepared for these people, starting with Athena, because it was the anniversary of the day we met, which meant she would be wakened with apple juice and an Egg McMuffin. Mouses was obviously up for a reason. He looked real strange, pale and kind of shambling along towards me. A little zombie-like, frankly. He was stroking that epic beard of his. And he said to me, "Lionel, would you mind dropping me off at a hospital if you're going out? I do believe I've had some sort of heart attack." A very unique experience, he described it to us later, an experience full of contrasts. When he'd woken up, he felt a bit disconnected, an odd floating sensation, as if his body were trying to levitate itself, but just couldn't. His entire left side had been very warm, and he had no clue where he was, what day it was, or what his last name was. For some reason, he looked down at his right hand and thought, "Wow, look how old I am. Look at that wrinkled skin. I'm really up there. How did that happen?" Athena whisked herself out of her sleeping bag and came along with us, naturally. Mouses didn't need us to help him out or anything, and he didn't even seem to want us to touch him. He got into the front seat of the van and we went off. And I was very nervous because one moment I was absolutely sure where the hospital was, and the next moment I wasn't so positive about it. The landmarks weren't quite where I'd thought they were. I didn't want to stress anyone out unnecessarily, so I went on faith, and I didn't tell Mouses or Athena that I had these doubts. I guessed in the end. I took a turn that might have really led us astray. For one terrible second, I thought I was completely lost. But in that one instance, I got things right. We went into the emergency room and they were very quick and responsive. Mouses was scared. Of course he was scared. He was trying to be far too funny about the whole thing. That sort of gallows humor, you know. But his face, gray as a blanket. The doctor told us he was going to run about 1,000 tests. So Athena and I drove to McDonald's, and I bought her that wondrous anniversary breakfast, which cheered her up for a little while, but not too long. She was quite fond of that overly literate old warhorse, you know. Back in her college days, it had been him who told her just where her talents lay, so she'd stopped pursuing too much for herself. By the time I'd met her, in a book club a friend had forced me to join at gunpoint, she was no longer Athena Carew, the would-be writer, pianist, graphic designer, and yes, chocolatier. She'd embraced painting and teaching fully, having fallen in love leading classrooms because of the way Mouses had taught, letting the students talk just as much as he did, sometimes sitting and only listening for entire sessions. Still having a couple of hours to kill, we decided to just get outdoors for a while and breathe in some air that wasn't full of chalk dust. Maybe a half-mile from the hospital, there was a nice empty park with tennis courts and a playground and 3 or 4 soccer fields, so we took a brisk walk through that. It was another gorgeous morning, and it was going to be another gorgeous day. All spring, perfect, day after day. That's my memory of the weather. I might just be putting a weird spin on it, but even Athena started talking about how flawless it had been, as if we were living in Northern California. just like a certain sister of mine to whom I'd been writing a letter off and on, who thinks she's cooler than everyone else just because she hasn't seen snow in 8 years. Past the park, the surroundings got even nicer and more serene. There was a long downslope that ended beside a little creek and a field beside it with croquet wickets set up. And of course it was ruined, as these things so often are, by the presence of a zombie. This one was dead, again, or asleep or gone to rest, however you refer to it, just like the vast majority of the others. It was lying in the field near the creek in some tall grass. We felt the need to walk past it just to confirm it wasn't a homeless person or something. What the zombie was wearing was kind of puzzling. A long, flowing, pink bridesmaid's dress. Not a very attractive one, Athena said. When Athena said that, she got very quiet and very sad. I kind of crouched beside the dead woman and looked at her for a while. Her eyes were half open, and Athena looked into them silently, studying her, I guess, maybe artistically, or maybe just because it was tough to look away from a face like that. There was this one dandelion touching her forehead. Then there was a gunshot, and what came next was just too horrible to think about. The bullet hit the bridesmaid in the face, so the shot must have come from across the creek in the woods. The bullet just made it come entirely apart in the blink of an eye. And 1 second after that, a second shot hit the zombie's head, again in the same place, more or less. And Athena shrieked and grabbed me, and I wrenched her away from where we were standing, about 5 feet away from the body, which all of a sudden was a torso and legs and a dress with nothing that was recognizable as a head. I had my arm around Athena's shoulder, and I half carried her up the slope. She was coughing, sick, and making a strange sound deep inside her chest as if she were vibrating with the force of her shock and her fear. I sort of knew what had happened, that the bridesmaid was just target practice for someone, some vicious bastard who had thought it would be good sport to frighten us and do some damage to a zombie at the same time. God knows why I just assumed that, why I didn't assume someone was trying to kill us both. Anyway, we got into the van and drove away. Athena didn't cry. She just doesn't cry. It's not her way. And that was how, in conjunction with Mouse's stroke, a perfect summer day became something totally different once again, just like at the baseball stadium with that room full of ashes. I held Athena for a long time as we sat in the parking lot of the hospital. Finally, she said, "I really want to go home, Lionel." And I said, "I know." And I told her we'd talk about it that night, when everything had settled down. With Athena, that kind of statement was a contract, and she would remember it. Happy anniversary. Mouses had actually just had some kind of arrhythmia, thank God. Mouses who'd claimed to never have been sick a day in his life. And when the doctor went through his medical records, that confirmed it. And now the doctor had given him a list of 500 things to be careful of and told him that he had to get tested for various things every few months. Mouses refused to stay the night there. That got a bit ugly. He said the experience of it all would not be worth the extra few years they wanted to tack on to his life. And Athena said, "Well, I'm going to make sure you go back for the tests, you creaky old mess, whether you like it or not." All she and I reported about our morning walk was that we'd seen an unpleasant sight or two. Nothing more. Everyone was up by the time we got back, of course, so we told them what Mouses had been through, and everyone treated him with kid gloves, which instead of irritating him, seemed to bring him a little satisfaction. Maybe it was the first time since he'd won a prize for his book about the German invasion of France, or his retirement party, that he had been fussed over so much. And Douglas Widgeon was still there, which kind of surprised me. I really think he wanted Ronnie to open up about his military experiences on the cleanup squads, especially about the new AWOL law. And maybe he was just there to work him a bit. But beyond that, it could be that he was just a little lonely. He'd gone through a pretty sad divorce, apparently. And for him, spending the day with us was just more fun than knocking around his apartment all day. We all sort of did our own thing for a couple of hours. When the stranger came, I know Ronnie was in the gym, shooting baskets and doing push-up after push-up. Mouses was sitting on the playground reading some Thomas Mann thing, I think it was Buddenbrooks, and talking with Widgeon about heart treatments. Widgeon's father had died of a stroke 10 years ago. Athena was in the music room, fiddling with the piano there. I was showing Melissa how to fix some things on the van. Melissa was a great show-me-how-to-do-that girl whenever she got bored. So I was showing her how to fill the washer fluid and top off the oil. And a gray Cadillac pulled into the parking lot. I should have parked the van around back and out of sight, of course, but after that morning's events, I hadn't been thinking. This guy was in his late 40s, early 50s, got out of the car, guy in very good shape, with a faint southern accent. And he came over and asked if we needed help with anything, if we were having mechanical problems. He introduced himself as Henry. He asked me, I don't know, a couple of questions about the van, but the most obvious question, which was why we were there, he didn't ask. I had an answer prepared, that we were going to knock some golf balls around the big field out back. Henry mostly asked what we thought about the morning news reports out of Salt Lake City, which we had not heard. He said people had been talking about a group of zombies that had attacked people in a bank. But mostly it had seemed unsubstantiated, and he hadn't even heard it on more than one station. Finally, he left. He gave us a little wave, and he rolled his Cadillac out onto the main road and drove out of sight. Then we went back in. Ronnie was waiting right inside the door. And the first thing he said to me was, "Lionel, I've got to get out of here. And now." He said that the man we'd just been speaking to was definitely military, and that he was going to be back very soon. Ronnie had been watching the whole encounter, and he said he could tell from the guy's walk that he was military. Every little thing about him, he was sure of it. He was utterly convinced he was right about this. I was kind of lost. I said, "Jesus, Ronnie, they're really looking for you? What the hell did you do?" He thought the guy might be back with MPs within minutes. We were all walking down the hallway then, and Athena came out of the music room, asking what was up. Ronnie grabbed his backpack from the classroom he'd been sleeping in and started looking around for his wallet. Melissa just looked frightened. I thought she had a little crush on Ronnie. He was going to go out the back. He didn't want us to just hop in the van and go in case we were pulled over by MPs. So we decided we'd meet him on the little street around the corner from the arts center we'd been at a specific time. He really wanted us to disappear until then, if not for his sake, then because the next time someone came to ask questions, we might get into trouble for being inside the school, and that would give someone an excuse to hold us and pelt us with questions about where Ronnie had gone to. He had no idea where he was going to go. He didn't know anything about the area, so he thought he'd just head deeper into the woods for a while, figure out his way from there, find some dive maybe, and read a book with his chair facing the front window for a while. Anyway, for all he knew, when he left us and went into those woods, he was one of the very first people ever to actually get into a serious, dangerous fight with a zombie that wanted to kill him. It was a little tense between me and Athena as we gathered up our things. She kind of answered me in either monosyllables or pointing, as if to say, "All right, if you say we have no time to talk, we have no time to talk. Let's be out of here and forget we were ever here. That's fine. We're done with this place. Now you need to be as fast as you've asked us to be. Come on." And we were in the van and driving away very quickly. Widgeon had climbed into the van with us without ever giving a care to his own car. He just left it. And I thought, yeah, this Widgeon guy is a lot like me. Maybe it just never quite woke up in him till now. At first, we just went grocery shopping, and then Athena suggested we all splurge a little and have a really good meal at a restaurant somewhere. Someplace where Mouses could eat really terribly, since the next day she'd start making sure he was really watching himself. We wound up at some sleazy place with pool tables because that's where everyone wanted to go secretly. In the middle of me destroying Widgeon at pool, they switched the TVs in the place over to CNN, which was reporting 3 more confirmed attacks by zombies against people. That entire restaurant was just riveted to the TV. Things were changing fast, for no reason anyone could understand. We were a little bit late in meeting Ronnie because we got kind of lost. You'd have really thought that with all our backroads driving, we would have seen some zombies, but no. We kept the radio tuned to the news. For now, they were still going on with regular programming, more or less. Ronnie was sitting on the steps of the arts center with his head down. He got into the van, and you couldn't help but notice that the left sleeve of his t-shirt was gone. I asked him about it right off, and he said, "Well, it's been a really, really interesting evening." He hadn't been 500 feet into the woods next to the school when it had happened. There was a very thin trail beaten down and leading back into the heavier brush, where it eventually ended. But standing in the center of the trail, shambling towards him, was an old man in a brown suit, a zombie, walking no faster than they always did, really. Ronnie was going to give him a wide berth just because that was his instinct. Everyone's instinct was to avoid them, but this one was coming right at him. So Ronnie, buff and fearless, started to run directly towards him, and he was going to elbow him out of the way as he ran, just to get past him as fast as he could and not have to absorb too much detail. He swung his elbow when he was within 2 feet, and out of nowhere, the old guy lunged at him, lunged at his neck. Ronnie dragged the zombie along for a few feet, and it wasn't letting go, and he'd never really felt one like that up close, in direct contact. And he was so repulsed that for a second he didn't even fight back. And then it opened its mouth, filmy, sick eyes rolling into the back of its head, and the old man went for a bite of Ronnie's leg. He told us that, and then with one question from Widgeon, Ronnie finally began to talk, really talk, and open up about the other things. His time with the cleanup squads, the inflated statistics he claimed were designed to scare the public, the time he gashed his hand on a railing and had to be hospitalized, and found that his medical records later showed that he'd contracted STG from a zombie scratch, which he had not. Another statistical lie to get the world to believe we were all in terrible danger, and so should look the other way as land was reclaimed, boundaries redrawn, political enemies muted, pharmaceutical contracts signed to make millions off an antibiotic no one really needed. STG didn't exist, Ronnie said. And when he'd fought to get his medical record corrected, he'd found nothing but evasions and excuses, and was mysteriously placed on lesser details. Ronnie sat there cross-legged in the van and got more and more worked up, and sometimes Mouses would furrow his brow and say, I'm sorry, Ronnie, I don't understand one thing. And he would ever so delicately redirect him back to a fact that didn't seem to jibe with some others. It made Ronnie grow more and more frustrated until he seemed to not be Ronnie anymore. The big guy, as handsome as a movie star and occasionally better with words than even Mouses, disappeared. And we found ourselves listening to a conspiracy theorist we'd never known was there. Some of it did seem plausible, but some of it seemed, well, the storyline just didn't work. But Ronnie, Mouses said once more, if that's true, then what doesn't make sense is that dozens of independent organizations have, and Ronnie cut him off. Look, I'm telling you the people running this all are capable of anything, he insisted, red in the face, until we all fell silent and just let him finish. This young boy came out in him, one wanting to blame his troubles on monsters that no one could quite see. I know he was telling the truth to us as he saw it, but how likely were they really to come after him? And how much of it was him trying to convince himself that he wasn't to blame for his mistake of volunteering for a part of the army when he hadn't really understood it? I mean, I had no trouble accepting the notion that they'd gotten loose with statistics and records and exaggerated the STG menace, lied, gone a little bit mad with power. But Ronnie was taking it further. He was asking us to believe in some monolithic entity that suddenly had his personal ruination in mind. All I could think of was maybe there was a point when Ronnie simply wanted a truth that wasn't really quite there. And he reached for it because it gave him license to make his past into something that they had destroyed, not something he'd kind of lost himself. I'm sorry, Ronnie. I'm sorry, man. We kind of left things up in the air with no one knowing quite what to believe. Athena was totally ready to believe the worst. I was still trying to see some better other side to it all. A military convoy went past us as we drove along 80, a bigger one than we'd seen before, about 6 or 7 trucks. We turned on the radio, and the news station was going live now, preempting everything else, with all kinds of reports about zombies getting violent. The commentators began to repeat themselves, trying to fill up dead air, as it were, and then they gave up, and classical music came back on for a bit. Athena was scanning the map, and she'd found a campground a mile away near Lake Linganore, so we checked it out. Mouses and Widgeon, sorry, I know I should call them by their first names, I'll try, went in and got us 3 cabins for the night, those rickety things with some bunk beds and nothing else. But wow, were they cheap. The woman behind the counter in the reservations hut didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary about the night, except that it was really, really slow. That was a very unsettling feeling, bringing the sleeping bags and such into the cabins, because we were all keeping one eye out for shambling things at the tree line that might come after us. There was not a sound around the campground. Athena and I finally got to be alone. I interrupted her doing what she could to make our bunk comfortable and sat down with her there and stroked her hair a little. She let me, looking at the floor, trying to smile but not quite able. What do you think I should do if we go home now? I asked her. I know we're just about out of money, but I look at the options and She surprised me with her response. If this is the end of everything, she said, I do want to see it up close. I don't want to read about it online. Let's go in 24-hour increments. Won't be the end of everything, I said, trying to be reassuring. She looked out the window. It was a nice country and all, a few nice ideas, she said. We'll make a list for next time. We didn't see any zombies that night. When Melissa really had to go to the bathroom bad, me and Douglas walked her over. Wouldn't that have been hilarious, Melissa said, if that's how one got her? Because she went into a stall and it jumped on her, and she got eaten just because she wanted to go have a pee? Douglas and I didn't really think that was funny. Melissa told us to lighten up just a little. But inside her usual levity, I thought I'd started to hear something more confused and afraid. Douglas had no one to call, really. Funny how it really sank into him that night that he had no one to call. Melissa left a message on her father's cell phone telling him she was safe and all right. And Mouses left a message at the desk of his mother's nursing home. Douglas said to me, It's weird, but it feels like something's really happening to me for the first time in a long time. Like something I can't really plan for. My free will seems gone, and I feel real light because of it. Athena and I were the first ones to wake up the next morning. She and I crept out of the cabin and walked down to the reservations hut, where there was a TV set. It hadn't been on the night before, but we figured we could ask the woman there to flip it on for us. She was standing out in front of the building, and there were 4 or 5 other people there too, in a circle around a dead body in the grass. They'd been waiting for a specimen control van to show up for an hour and a half, but none had come. One of the campers, who'd been sleeping on the other side of the campground from us, had a zombie stumble right over his little one-man tent, collapsing it right on top of him. And then the zombie had pawed against the tent until the man had scrambled out, and the zombie had gone after him. It had taken 2 other campers to beat it down till it stopped moving. I found Mouse's letter a half-hour later. Lionel. No sleep for me tonight, I'm afraid. I'm not terribly worried about zombies or my own defective heart. It's just the usual insomnia of an old bastard trying to figure out things for himself. I think the best course for me right now is to step off this cruise ship and head back to Porch Lane. If not right away, then maybe first to my mother's nursing home to check in on her. If it happens that I'm not around when things get back to normal, if they ever do, it doesn't necessarily mean I've gone to my last reward or they've thrown me into an old age home myself. It might mean that I've gone off on my own little trip. It's time to be alone again, truly alone, which is something I haven't experienced in almost 40 years. I'm interested in seeing what a 71-year-old man can absorb from his country on the road when things are at their strangest. And this feels like the last time I'll be able to stand by myself. Every instinct I have tells me that it's time for you to go home now, Lionel. Not because you've seen all there is to see, but because you'd be risking too much by going on. Melissa, Ronnie, and I have gotten much out of our little vacation from reality, but I'm afraid Athena really hasn't. She never needed any escape from anything. It was all a gift to you, her coming along, as you probably know. I wouldn't want to see you damage the best thing you have going in your life. I remember when I returned to the States after going to Vietnam in 1969 for the university, what it felt like to be immersed in chaos for 6 months, and then, after my flight home touched down at LAX, to sit in my car in the parking garage for an hour before driving back to my apartment, with all that silence and routine waiting for me. I felt depressed for almost a year and a half, because nothing on this side of the world could compare to the grisly drama and the ugly electricity that watching a war up close generated. Now I see you carried away on that same current, living a life that's become weirdly charmed because the country is so tattered and sinking. What I saw of war was revolting and painful and ugly, but it was thrilling in a dark way. And so is this, of course. And I completely understand what it's like for you to feel such energy and vitality during the day and go to sleep with great guilt that it's finally found you only because of the dawning of such horror. So you'll go back to Porch Lane, I hope. And maybe you'll have to wait tables at another restaurant or work with the textbooks again at the campus for less money than any adult should make, and feel empty inside too many days of the week, and still remain very much lost as to what your life should be. The faster you get back there, though, the better, because that's where Athena is. And as long as you have her, your fight to understand yourself will be far less brutal than it could be. She's extraordinary, Lionel. She'll wait for you to catch up to her. She really will. She would wait for years, which is incredibly rare. And she won't yearn for New York or another degree because her patience is seemingly infinite. But to test that patience would be the act of a damned fool. She knew you were confused about where the hospital was, and that for a second you were really panicked. But she never did let on. She waited to see if she absolutely had to say something. And then you made the right guess. With her, you've won a lottery whose odds brutalize almost everyone. Never make the mistake of thinking you're so special that you could win it twice. I'm going to do something a little crazy now and leave this note in your shoe, and then walk right out of this cabin and down the road. There are few things quite as delirious as an old man in tennis shoes walking down a country road and not knowing where he's headed. I hope I get to see you both back on the lane before too much time goes by. I'm dashing off a quick letter of Athena's own, 50 words or so to say so long for now. And this one we can keep just between us. Your bespectacled friend, Mouses. The radio and TV kicked into overdrive with their 24-hour coverage then, and it lasted something like 4 days. Zombies which had never been disposed of were waking up somehow, and new ones were everywhere. These zombies were definitely aggressive. And while there was no cannibalism going on that anyone could tell, they would have a go at anything from dogs to children. We were all in the van, except Mouses, and I thought I was headed toward the highway, but then I turned off and no one said anything. But it was sort of like we were just going to be spinning our wheels, and we should have talked about where to go next before we'd left the cabins. So we wound up back at the elementary school. I said, look, this should at least be pretty safe for a bit. And there we were, bringing our stuff back in. There was one other stop in there somewhere that I remember I should mention. I wanted to buy a new notebook. I'd run out of room in the one I carried everywhere, and which I tried not to open in front of anyone. Even Athena didn't know what the deal with it was. I told Douglas and Ronnie I wrote letters to my sister in it and kept a careful track of all their heights and weights. They didn't need to know about the notebook. Ronnie and I figured that one thing to do, to begin with, when we settled in again at the school, was to check the place out from top to bottom, just to make absolutely sure there was nothing in there that might come at us instead of just drifting on by. The two kindergarten rooms were sort of funny because their ceilings were actually lower than in the other rooms, as if they'd figured, well, everyone in here is really small, so why not bring the roof down a bit? The first room had been the domain of someone named Mrs. Kirchner. On the chalkboard, someone had written a few sentences. There was no way of knowing when they had done it. It was a kind of poem. Beside it, they'd drawn a zombie in 8 or 9 quick slashes. Its arms were reaching out at whoever was looking at it. The poem said, Lazarus stumbled into a bar, said, give me 3 shots of whiskey, for I have come far. The other side's mysteries still swirl in my eyes. The party really starts when a man ups and dies. Gather round to learn of the sights I have seen, and pour enough Jack to make my tootsies turn green. The bartender nodded and smiled and said, we're all sure impressed you've come back from the dead, but save those damn visions for some cheerier day. You're just going to scare my patrons away. I think from your face, your voice, and that smell, all you can teach us is it still sucks in hell. We opened the door to the principal's office, and it was the shock of my life, I mean it. Because it was like I just walked into a dream. Reality snapped. There was a man in there, behind the desk in the office, just sitting there in a suit and looking through some papers, like it was the middle of a school day and he had reports to go over. And suddenly 2 intrepid zombie hunters had stumbled in from another world, like 2 dimensions had gotten accidentally brushed together and were never supposed to have seen each other. I recognized him at once because, of course, this was the guy from the photos in the office, Principal Polly, the guy who had all his awards festooned around the office. He had absolutely no expression on his face. There was no shock, no anger, no nothing. His hair was perfectly neat, and he had this dark blue suit on. And he wasn't saying anything. He said absolutely nothing to us, shocked as he must have been to be walked in on. So I had to speak. I told him we were really sorry that we'd come across this school and had thought it was empty, and we were going to leave soon. We just stopped for a little while. No response, except for a little, almost imperceptible nod he made at us. He was actually holding these papers in his hands, and he set them down, and then he got up out of his chair very slowly. Ronnie and I didn't know what else to say. I was scared because I thought this guy might have gone nuts. Why wasn't he saying anything? He got slowly to his feet, and he came around the desk, moving a little like an old man. And he moved right past Ronnie, and he went out the door and started walking down the hallway like he was 80 years old instead of just 45 or so. He had a very old walk. We had no idea what to say or do. I said something like, please stay, something really useless, but the exit doors were right there, and he pushed on the metal bar, and he went outside. There was no car out there or anything. He just walked across the parking lot and across the road. He didn't look left or right to see if any cars were coming. He went onto the jogging path that went all the way to the middle of town, and he went down it and out of sight. I looked at Ronnie, and he looked at me, and I said, hey, Ronnie, is it just remotely possible that we just talked to a goddamn zombie? This letter shall end, dear sister, with one last description of an occurrence which simply could not have really taken place, and yet it did. I saw my stalker zombie one more time. It was that very same evening. My zombie in the house dress was in the field that sloped away from the playground. She was wandering from east to west, never looked towards me. How could I tell it was her when it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I was so far away? Well, there was a full moon out, and she had a certain walk I'd come to know, and blah, 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 but what it comes down to is I just knew. I assume the postal system is still up and running, and they've added Nor the Walking Dead to that little rhyme of theirs, so this letter should get to you in a couple of days. Say hi to the husband and the Totniks, stay indoors for a while, and write me back at Porch Lane for when I get back there eventually. And tell me what I should call the book I'm going to list all these stories in. It'll have to be a very original name, mind you. Song of the Living Dead is already taken, thanks to Widgeon. Because the world is going to be full of books just like this one in no time at all. Love, Lionel. In scene 31 of Song of the Living Dead by Douglas Widgeon, shown on Minnesota Public Television in December of 2006, the narrator of the documentary explains that on a beautiful May day, Melissa's friend, Lionel Gathers, hey, that's me, drove her to a Denny's restaurant in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where her father would pick her up and finally take her home. She'd been on the road with her friends for more than 3 weeks, but they decided finally that it was too complicated and perhaps too dangerous now to keep her with them any longer. When they arrived at the restaurant's parking lot, Melissa's father had not yet arrived, so they sat in the van for a half hour and waited for him. We hadn't said much on the drive up there. It was 2 hours, and we just listened to the news, I guess. When we got there, we were looking through the windshield at this guy who was across the parking lot. He was sitting on the little step in front of Denny's, which was closed. This guy was just sitting there with his head down, almost like he was asleep. But he had one arm stretched out, and he was petting this dog who was sitting beside him, petting him with one arm over and over and over again, in exactly the same pattern, but never looking up. We were watching that, and I decided to, be an adult for Melissa for once. All this time we'd known her, about a year by then, I hadn't bothered with all that. That was more Athena's job. But now Athena wasn't around. She'd already hugged Melissa goodbye. I wanted Melissa to remember that exact moment, the time when she was waiting for her father to come get her. I told her that as soon as she got out of the van, she wouldn't really be 17 anymore, that she would have aged somehow, just in the past couple of months. By going back with her parents, I thought it would sink into her without her even knowing it, how suddenly she would be more than 17. She'd be an age that had no real number. I told her that because of the zombies and how messed up everything around her had become, she might feel angry sometimes and not understand why. I told her not to let anything make her forget that she was young, not her parents, not the zombies, not anything. I really wanted her to turn out the lights that night later when she went to bed and say to herself, I am young, I am young, I am young. I know I'm an idiot for trying to teach her everything I'd ever learned in the parking lot of Denny's. And it got all mixed up in my mind and my mouth somehow, and it didn't come out right. And Melissa started to cry. In the documentary, she tells Douglas Widgeon that she does want to be like other people. She wants to have a nice house someday and a good job, and get married and live in a little neighborhood somewhere, and drive one of those cars that nobody notices. And she says on the screen she'll have a bunch of cats too, and 2 boring kids, and spend her weekends at Home Depot and go on vacation in Ocean City. And when people asked her about the zombies someday, she'd say, oh yeah, way back when. That was a really big deal for a while. It was like September 11th and the Vietnam War. But we got over it. Her father pulled up there at Denny's finally. When they drove away, I was still sitting in the van. I had promised Melissa I wouldn't go anywhere until she was out of sight, because I didn't want it to feel like me and Athena and the rest were leaving her. I wanted it to feel like the other way around. So the van stayed, and Melissa went wherever it was she was going to.
Part 3. Lionel's Notebook.
When I got back that night, Ronnie was already gone. He'd stayed till about noon, and then he'd called a cab and he talked the dispatcher into sending one that would take him all the way to Point of Rocks. There was a commuter train to Washington from there. And he said he'd improvise his way further south, maybe figure out a way to get on a bus, take a chance, show his ID. Athena said he just tapped lightly on the door to the library, where she was looking through some books. His backpack had been slung over one shoulder. And he said, "Take care, okay?" And he left without another word. I liked Ronnie. He was a big, muscular guy, but he wanted to be invisible. He wanted to follow orders, to do what America told him because it seemed to make sense. He thought going into the army was going to give him a mission. It just didn't turn out that way. After Ronnie left, it was just Athena and Douglas in the school. So she turned on the radio, but then she turned it off again right away after hearing the top story on the news, which was about some man who was attacked and killed inside a movie theater west of Miami, supposedly. And she didn't want to hear anymore. Douglas smoked just outside the main entrance. As he looked out on the road, he told me, for some reason, he had this mental image of 1,000,000 zombies walking at us, coming from over the hill, all with their arms stretched out towards us, and with us nowhere to run to. 4,000 troops had been called out to go on emergency elimination missions, meaning they were out to destroy whatever was walking around with something less than the tact which they had tried to adhere to up until now. On the drive back from Gettysburg, I'd had to make 3 detours because the army had temporarily closed down a road. 3 detours, that was a lot. Traffic was a killer too, because a lot of people were getting the hell out of whatever town they were in, just up and leaving. Hearsay had it that they were getting harder to put down too, the zombies were. Anecdotes reported from person to person, finally winding up on the radio. But it was a hell of a lot of anecdotal evidence, it really was. We all took the van out and went to the grocery store. We had to stand in line for half an hour. People were just buying anything and everything. They had a policeman hanging around the place in case of trouble, either from the dead or from the living who just didn't feel like paying for their bread and toilet paper. Mouses once told me that one of the scariest moments a country can face is not when it's about to be attacked or invaded or occupied, because that very sense of terror can stir up a strong defense or reactionary patriotism. No, something scarier, he said, is when the bottom drops out of everything, and no one cares about their home anymore. He'd felt this in countries where the government pushed things too far against its own people, and the people struck back, destroying not just their leaders, but the infrastructure of the land as well. He said you could feel it when a small nation's economy fell right through the floor, when their money became useless. The dead becoming violent broke the last mental defenses of people who already tended to believe the universe was random, and that God had removed himself from the scene long ago. They reacted by staging bizarre parades, by defacing the country with billions of splashes of graffiti, by leaving their jobs in the middle of meetings. Some people reacted with violence, terrible violence. I won't go into all that here. But as bad as things got, one fact was always sadly true, that the number of people killed by zombies that year was drastically less than the number of people who killed each other in the darkest of all possible reactions to them. That night, Athena and I lay together in the dark in my sleeping bag. We didn't say anything, nothing at all for a long time, and then she asked me where we were going the next morning. I asked her if we could go just a little bit farther. A little bit farther, Athena, please. But we would go north, the 3 of us, back in the general direction of where we'd come from. And we'd roam back on that general path toward Porch Lane. And we'd just kind of see what happened. I just wanted to see what happened, that was all. I was just curious to see what was what. There really were an awful lot of disturbances on the roads, and we traveled the back routes all the way. There were twice as many cars on those country roads as normal, and twice we were stopped dead for about 15, 20 minutes. There was a gigantic tidal movement to rural areas. Anyone who had a friend living in the middle of nowhere wanted a few nights' stay. So even the back roads were sometimes clogged. Athena was aghast at our diet that day because we couldn't find one roadside stand that was open to sell us vegetables. That was a really ominous sign. I didn't see how anything could stop farmers from needing to sell their crops, but this apparently had. There was this little place, Sazler's Hardware, on the side of Route 109, and it was open, and we pulled in. Douglas said we should probably, just in case, have a little something to knock one of the bastards over if we got surprised, right? Athena stayed in the van and we went shopping. She was pretty disturbed by the idea. We bought 3 crowbars. The owner asked us if we wanted a handwritten receipt because the printer inside the register was all out of ribbon. And Douglas said, "Oh, does that mean we can return these when we're done with them?" That was one memorable feeling, holding that thing in my hands. It was utterly ridiculous, but boy, did I feel ready to use it. Come and get me, that's what I thought. I must have been going out of my mind. At about 6 on the day we left the school for good, after driving northeast for 3 hours, kind of stop and go, Douglas mentioned the studios. The studios where WRTH used to videotape their programming were scheduled to be torn down, and it was basically just 2 big warehouses sitting in the hills outside York. Douglas thought no one had used them for going on 2 months, and figured it might be the perfect place to crash for the night if we wanted. They'd taken down the fencing around the studios and hauled them off to the new ones in the city, so it wouldn't be much of a problem getting in, and he was almost certain not a soul would be there or within a mile of the place. The only problem might be that we'd have to break into the studio buildings themselves. And as soon as I heard that, of course, I said, yeah, let's go there. Douglas had been there 2 or 3 times doing some editing work. To get there, we just drove through a little unattended gate and down a long dirt road. It was public television, so there was no writs to it, no security or secrecy. RTH had apparently been on the verge of selling the property outright to the golf course adjacent to it. They were going to bulldoze the trees between the course and the studios and add some holes or something. But the new studios were already up and running in the city, and it was just a matter of time before the old ones were torn down. We got there about 7. The gate was unlocked, and it didn't seem like anyone else was around. There were no cars in the little dirt lot. I just had a lousy feeling about the place. Athena said to me, "Come on, let's go to a motel." I said, "Yeah, you're right, probably, but let's check it out. Maybe we'll change our mind." And then I gave her a crowbar, and I gave Douglas his, and we went in with protection. The place had no windows, not one, because of course that would have messed with the lighting on the sets. So we had to jimmy one of the doors. There were some light switches right next to our heads when we went in, and luckily about half of them still worked, so we could see everything, even though it was a little bit dim. RTH really had very little money, Douglas said, so there weren't even any walls between the sets. They'd tape a segment of their money show in Space C, which was 5 feet away and not separated at all from Space B, where they did a kids show. It was like a cheap studio apartment blown up to 20 times normal size. The funny thing was that right in front of us was a bedroom set, a period thing, like 19th century. There were props suggesting that time. There was an old-fashioned wrought iron bed with a mattress and covers, and I looked at Athena and said, "Now do you want to go to a motel?" She put her crowbar down on the bed, and we looked around. She didn't want to carry it. There was no sense in it, right? Us guys had ours. And nothing really bad could happen to us, because we were special. We were the good guys. Everything that was happening was just a big movie screen, and we were watching it, and not really involved. Being in that studio was so perfect, seeing those empty sets and the backdrops that had been painted for imaginary scenes and plots. None of it was real. Athena was glad Melissa wasn't there as soon as we turned on the lights. Melissa had expressed interest in becoming an actress, and Athena didn't want that for her. She didn't want her to play with all this illusion stuff. She didn't want her living in a dream world. There was one backdrop that had been painted, and I really wanted to know what it had been used for. It was fascinating. Douglas and I were going through a bunch of them because they were all leaning against one wall. And he would get on one side, and I would get on the other side, and we would push them forward one by one, just looking at them. But the one we found, which was so strange and puzzling, was a 10 by 20-foot slab showing a reddened horizon and a huge gathering of zombies spread out over it, walking toward the viewer. And in the foreground, there was just one boy looking out into the distance and waiting for them to come. He wasn't armed or anything. What he did have in his hands was a violin, and he was playing it. So the effect was the zombies had been drawn out of the hills and over the horizon by the sound of his playing, like a fairy tale almost. It was so big, this painting, they must have been planning a very unusual show or documentary or play or whatever. Near the back of the studio, or at least what I thought was the back, was a huge wall, but it was one of those sliding ones, like in a barn. I guess they closed it when they needed silence on the other side. I misjudged the size of the place. It was far bigger than I had first thought. I never asked Douglas why he had suddenly felt the need to open that wall. I think he just wanted to see it all. I'd jogged over to help him with the bolt that locked the wall. Athena was about 5 feet away when we started to slide the wall open. Now I think back on what Douglas had told us about that reality show his acquaintance of an acquaintance had been planning. The one about all the zombies on the island. And the story that maybe they had collected some to use. He'd said no one thought they'd really gone so far as to do that, but if they had, they would have had to put them someplace. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere so no one would get suspicious or ever find them until they needed them. I think what are the odds that any part of the story was true and that they really said, well, we know exactly a place we can use. And when I think the odds are absurdly slim of any of that happening, well, I think about Ronnie's claims against the government, and I think of the chances of the dead returning to life and attacking the living, and my head begins to hurt. If the universe can think of such things to throw at us, Athena once said to me, human beings are even worse. They always have been. They always will be. We shoved the giant wall to the left along its rollers, and it had gotten maybe 4 feet when the zombies started pouring out at us. When we let go of the wall, it slid another 4 or 5 feet, and they all came at us from that gap. The force of their momentum through the gap pushed it little by little even further open, until by the end, by the time they were all out, the wall was a third of the way open. We still had our crowbars in our hands, Douglas and I did, but when Douglas stumbled backwards and one of the zombies landed on top of him, I looked up right away and saw that Athena did not have hers. There'd been no smell that had led us to believe the wall hid 30 zombies, 50 maybe. We hadn't heard any shuffling or movement, nothing. When they appeared, I went totally numb, and my shouting to Athena was just instinct. A zombie was right in front of me, but there was one just to my left, too, which was where Athena was standing. So I swung at that one first, a woman, having no conscious thought whatsoever in my brain. I went right for her head, and I swung as hard as I could. The sound was like I'd hit a bag of seed or something, and that one went down. And then I swung back at the one right in front of me, and I got him in the neck with the hook part. And something weird happened to his eyes when it went in. His pupils or whatever just shot to the right, and he went down too. Douglas had managed to get on top of the one which had pinned him down, and he got up, almost falling over, and he swung his crowbar right down on the thing's head. I had no revulsion. I didn't gasp in terror. That all left me instantaneously. The new things we had to become didn't even know their own names. Athena hadn't run. The first thing I saw her do was whip her right fist against the side of some zombie's face viciously hard, knocking it aside. She just started swinging, and she hit me on the shoulder with one of the swings, which I only felt much later when the bruise formed. One of the zombies she hit kept coming at her, and it grabbed her left arm, so I hit it in the back with the crowbar, and at the same time I felt these cold fingers go into my mouth. I spat them out and felt something's arms around my waist. But I had to get that zombie off Athena's arm because it was opening its mouth and going for her flesh. I hit it in the back of the head. Blood flew up and hit Athena in the neck. Then I just started shoving the butt end of the crowbar against the forehead of the one that had me until it slid off me. The most awful part was that for a second or two I couldn't see Athena at all because we were literally surrounded. I kept screaming her name and she kept screaming mine. I swung the crowbar until I got to her. She had blood all over her. And at first I thought it was hers, but it was because I'd been hitting these things in the head so hard, it kept spraying on her. Douglas was kneecapping them, putting them down instead of going for the heads. Athena just pushed them, slapped them, punched them, anything she could. She tried to grab my hand to pull me out of there, but I was in the midst of swinging the crowbar, and it tore me free of her. Going for the knees was more effective, yeah. But I found myself not doing that. I found myself looking into their eyes and hitting them in the head with absolutely all the force I could muster. And I think once that when I missed, I came very close to hitting Athena. But I tell myself I really can't know if she was still that close, though I sensed she was. I think I came very close indeed to hitting her. I couldn't control myself. I just knew that if I connected solidly with the heads, it meant I got to keep standing for a couple of more seconds. The last zombie I saw Athena hit, she brought her fist against the side of its head, and it went off balance a bit, but it was still standing, so she took a step forward and hit it again in the same place, and it was fully tumbling over then, falling to the floor, its tongue protruding from its stupid mouth. But she went after it, to hit it one more time, just full of rage, full of the wanting to punish it, to make the zombie go down instead of just watching it fall. That led her as far away from me as she had ever been, so I ran to her, and Douglas had gotten free and gotten there too, and we got away. The door we'd come in through had that broken knob, so Athena just threw all her weight against it, and we were out. In the zombie movies I used to watch with my friends, no matter how bad things got, there were always 2 or 3 survivors left, the good guys, and they went into the sunset or whatever to fight another day. The people who made these things were always careful to have some hope at the end. Mouses used to say, what would have been interesting before all this is if they'd made a zombie story and in the end the zombies truly won. They'd finally gotten rid of all the humans on the earth, so there couldn't be any band of survivors to go underground to repopulate. All that would be left would be the millions of buildings around the world that people had built before they'd all been devoured. There wouldn't be a single sound left, except for the footsteps of the zombies. With the last dying breath of the final hero, all of human history would fade away, and all the meaning and all the property and structures on the earth would disappear. The dead would wander those structures aimlessly, never starving, never lying down. The seasons would change and they would walk. Earthquakes would strike and they would walk. If it were a movie, Mouses said, it could end with 3 straight silent minutes of zombies and their meaningless shuffling. Just the sound of the wind over a protracted montage of the earth, finally possessed by a race that didn't even care to own it. How peaceful. How perfect. How darkly beautiful in a way that can't be put into words. I remember coming awake that night and having no idea where I was. We were just miles away. I was in the passenger seat with a blanket over me, and I looked through the windshield at some trees. I just didn't understand what had happened. Even when I turned and looked at the back of the van, where Athena was sleeping. Douglas was in the passenger seat, conked out. I thought I wouldn't be able to sleep anymore. I just looked out the window as the light went from a deep blue to a lighter blue. I read the rules of the park we were in off the sign in front of the van. Sometime during the night, someone had come along and left a styrofoam coffee cup on the hood. Athena lay on her side, like normal. Douglas's head was leaning against the window, using his t-shirt as a pillow. I stared at that styrofoam coffee cup through the windshield, thinking it would be good to get something like that in the morning, when Athena and Douglas woke up. And at some point I was asleep again. My mind did something quite nice for me then. My dream was about me sitting in a Dunkin' Donuts, drinking the kind of hot coffee I'd imagined might be in that cup on the hood of the van. And there was nothing more than that. That was more than enough. And that was kind of the ending to our story. Almost. Douglas Widgeon's documentary, Song of the Living Dead, aired quite a while after our awful evening at the studios of WRTH. The 80-minute film featured not only Melissa, but 4 other people under the age of 18, including a 12-year-old blind boy and a 16-year-old who was put in jail briefly for torturing zombies. Over the end credits, the blind boy stood in a field and played his violin, and I knew right away where Douglas had gotten that image from. The backdrop we'd found at the studio. He left me a message at Porch Lane telling me when the show would be on, and when it was over I called him and talked to him to catch up some after such a long time of not seeing him. He was doing fine, he said. He was in upstate New York and planning a film about the Battle of Antietam. About 2 months after he and I and Athena fought the zombies at RTH, Douglas had felt himself sinking into a severe depression. He assumed it was because of what had happened that night, and he went on antidepressants and stopped working on his movie. It took him months to start feeling himself again, and he thought now that he was going to be all right. When he asked me if I was somehow different since then, I honestly told him no, not really. I wanted to be, but I wasn't. The nightmares never came. But then I had Athena, and Douglas had no one. Melissa never saw the documentary. She didn't feel like watching it. Her parents never moved back to the house they'd owned just around the corner from me and Athena. Athena calls her about once a month and tries to get Melissa to focus on her college plans. Things haven't gotten any better between her and her parents, not at all. Athena thinks it's Melissa's determination to get away from them as soon as she can that keeps her grounded, keeps her away from partying and boys and cheerleading, keeps her grades nice and even. She has friends. It's going to be all right. Ronnie called us from Seattle in December. He was still AWOL and still had no intention of going back to the Army. He was working for a food co-op and really enjoyed it. He'd never found out the ultimate fate of his parents down in Georgia, and he felt ashamed about that. Mouses writes to Athena and I once every couple of months. I don't think he's coming back to the lane anytime soon. He's been back and forth across the country twice. He's hitchhiked, ridden a Vespa, and he knows I always wanted one of those. Ridden Greyhound, bought a $300 car that smelled like beets. The postmarks on his letters are always different. At the end of every letter, he tells me not to be envious. There's no point to that. I'm envious every single day. Meanwhile, the dead continue to walk. Scientists keep trying to figure out why this has all happened, and their explanations are conflicting and sometimes predictably bizarre. Unfortunately, no one's buying what they're selling. The recession is still going on, and it's brutal. America is still being viciously criticized for its decisions to send troops to areas of the world where it claims that sudden destabilizations due to zombie threats might make things too precarious. I finally did find out the identity of the zombie in the house dress, the one I accused of stalking me, the one I saw all those times hanging around the elementary school and elsewhere. Using my photograph, an outfit based in Atlanta called the Search Techs provided me with the answer to my question in about 2 weeks. She was Beverly Brierly, and she was my fourth grade teacher at Hillsmere Elementary School in Annapolis, Maryland, about 60 miles away from Gerard Manley Hopkins Elementary School in Buckystown, where our little gang stayed for a few nights that sunny and cloudless spring. She'd been just 25 or so when I was her student. I hadn't seen her since in all that time. But when I saw her face again, something had clicked. One day I remember my folks went in for a parent-teacher conference with Mrs. Brierly. When they came out of it, they took me out for a banana split. They were so happy with what she'd told them about me. She said she thought I could probably be anything I wanted when I grew up, that the future was boundless for me. She didn't like it when I goofed off too much or did less than I was capable of. If only I applied myself, she told them, my intelligence would carry me far. I'd told her I thought I wanted to be a writer. She'd said, "Then you are going to be a writer." She was proud of me. She believed in me. That was Mrs. Brierly. I'm here on Porch Lane now, and 7 more restaurants in town have closed since Z-Day 2. But I found some good shifts at one that stayed open. And I think about her all the time. All the time. I'm writing this last part from 188 Porch Lane, in the bedroom of the house I share with Athena, who's lying asleep after teaching a class at the community center, where in return for instructing people in painting techniques, she's provided a studio of her own. Sometimes she's there working all day and teaching all night and doesn't get home till about 11 or so. But we have weekends together still for another month or so, and then I have to start working Saturdays, just a few hours on Sundays, so we'll figure something out. We share the car, and I usually walk to work. It keeps me in shape. A couple of years ago, I went down to the pharmacy for some cough medicine, and I wound up also buying a 5-subject notebook, a big, thick blue deal for random notes and jottings. Sometimes I'd get frustrated by something I saw on the news, and I'd turn to the middle section of the notebook and scrawl a few words down about it. And once in a while, I'd see a homeless person or a severely handicapped person on the street, or hear about some tragedy that didn't make any sense, or, hard life stuff. And some words about these things went into the book as well. More recently, I'd be reacting to some decision this country had made regarding its treatment of people here I considered most in need of help, who weren't getting much of it, or our embrace of violence in all its seemingly mild forms. Most of what I wrote was indecipherable nonsense, gut reactions to big issues I didn't really understand. Then in December of last year, there was a tragedy that struck Athena and I. And I found myself writing in the last section of the notebook. A long horror story to take my mind off things, something ridiculous and implausible. It was so far-fetched, it actually seemed to help a little. When all was said and done, though, my story was also about a confused guy in his 30s who had misplaced the joy of living in a world where such beauty coexisted with such horror. So maybe there never were any actual zombies. No Z-Day 1 or 2, no controversial acts of military brutality. No travels across a couple of states with a group of my friends and the professional artist Athena Carew. Not that these people aren't real, they all are. Everyone who came with Athena and I in that van. Mouses, Ronnie, Douglas Widgeon, and Melissa. Friends or acquaintances, or maybe even just people we met very briefly once and exchanged no more than a few words with. Yeah, they're real. But the actual things they said and did, maybe they all came from the imagination of a man who hasn't written a story since he was 11 years old, and doesn't really understand too many of the rules of plausibility and linear plot, and had to resort to telling a tale of flesh-hungry zombies to relate his saddest fears about a world where some poisoned food would suddenly rip the life away from a 17-year-old friend of Athena's, who lived around the corner from us, and daydreamed of getting away from her parents, and of becoming an actress, or working in fashion, and going with us if we went to Amsterdam one summer. Melissa Lansford died in December of 2002, a victim of random chance and gross human negligence. A death that seemed designed to shock its witnesses into a hideous, revolted silence. Death took her in a particularly harsh, cowardly, uneducational way. And shortly afterward, out came my tale of zombies overrunning the planet, written in longhand across 107 pages. It was my way of challenging the universe to a contest of savagery. I wanted to write about a darkness so absurd that it would make darkness seem almost funny. Even in fiction, though, I couldn't quite keep us all together. But for a while, at least, I really did feel like I was driving that van, and we were all free of everything. I knew exactly what it would be like to cruise along the smooth blacktop of Buckystown Pike, with the driver's side window rolled down, and my friends passing around a map. It was like being told I'd be young for 100 years. Now Athena is sleeping a few feet away from me. She has been, and remains, my last line of defense against everything I imagine that lies outside the window to my left. Disease, violence, destruction, murder, intolerance, failure. She is smarter than I am, more successful than I feel I can ever be, more patient, more kind. She's so perfect in my eyes, it hurts sometimes just to leave to go to work. One step outside the door of 188 Porch Lane, and I am Lionel the waiter and the college dropout. To her, in our 4-room house, I'm somehow still Lionel the Great. Her love for me is mysterious and deep. Our friend Mouses once told me so in a letter after he had an incident with his heart, a letter I've reproduced, not quite verbatim, in this story. In a few minutes, I'll curl up beside her and say a little prayer. Help me be strong, Athena, I'll say. My country is not as pure as I'd always believed it to be, and I'm not either, and phantoms are everywhere. There are sunsets and oceans and images of you brushing your hair on our porch swing. And there are gunshots and freak accidents and people to whom cruelty is only a means to an end they believe is just. The images flash by me, too many to be counted, alternating between good and evil, and it seems impossible it can all exist so close to each other on the same earth. I believe you love me and always will, and I believe a beautifully played violin could summon hungry zombies from over the horizon, and that music could come from a dead woman's throat. Yes, darkness and light are so close together, so relentlessly at war, that this can all be. I have written it down in permanent pen. Nightmares dreamed in a field of perfect May grass, a bridesmaid fixed in a rifle sight. Words in a notebook you don't ever need to understand, which I will keep secretly for both of us, for as long as you stand beside me.